Good evening. Welcome to the campus of beautiful Flagler College. I am thrilled to deliver this special program and introduce our co-sponsors and our speakers for tonight. The title of the event is The Freedom to Teach, Confronting Complex Themes in Contested Spaces. This event would not have happened without the input, without the support, without the backing of our co-sponsors. First and foremost, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at the Macmillan Center at Yale University, the National Council for History Education, Florida Humanities, the Institute for Common Power, the National Humanities Center, and Duke University History Department. Our list of event partners are too numerous to name. They will be listed and are listed on the back of the program that will be distributed tomorrow morning when the event begins at 9 a.m. At Flagler College, I could not have done this without the support of many people, both known and unknown to those of us in the Flagler community. To start with, President John Delaney, Ms. Susan Connor in Institutional Advancement, Stephanie Burgess, the Director of Special Events, our fearless Dean in the College of Humanities and Sciences, Dr. Rachel Cremona, the Honors Program, my colleagues in the Humanities Department, and perhaps the person who has been the glue that kept me from falling apart on several different episodes, Ms. Jasmine Santos. A shout out to the two members of what we call the steering committee. It sounds much more formal than it is. Michelle Zaks at the GLC at Yale and Dr. Nancy McLean. They helped put this incredible event together. They were people who had tremendous ideas that they bounced off of me, and the work that they put in to bring together this program is, it defies quantification. One of the reasons that I'm most proud to bring this event to the campus, to the community, to the state, and virtually to anyone who can live stream, is because it started as something that's much different than it currently has become. It was going to be a traditional academic conference where we had esteemed historians and other scholars reading papers to hopefully 25 people in the audience, with the idea that it would start a robust discussion of thoughts, ideas, and concepts concerning this topic. But as we organized it, what we discovered is that many different constituencies wanted to be a part of this program. We have brought together, and when I say we, I mean all of us, not the steering committee, not one institution, not one institute, but we as a community have brought together academics to give perspective, of course, Pulitzer Prize winners, presidents of national organizations. We've brought together state humanities conferences. But more importantly, we've brought in teachers, the people who are on the front lines, who are living the reality that we are going to address and discuss. We've invited journalists in whose work has been immeasurable in getting to the essence of the issues that we are confronting. Public history professionals, people who run museums from the local all the way to the international, quite literally. So from an academic conference, this has developed into something that is unique in the state and, dare I say, the nation, because of all of the different voices, participants, and constituencies that we've brought together. We're here to learn from each other. We're here to dialogue. We're here to discuss our passions, our frustrations, and develop ways that we can all do our jobs much better than we did yesterday. So with that, I would like to say on behalf of Florida Humanities that funding for this program was provided through a sponsorship from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed at this conference do not necessarily represent those of Florida Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. But enough from me. You're here to hear an incredible journalist discuss and engage in conversation with a tremendous individual. TAMMIE Fields is the weekday evening co-anchor at Spectrum News 13. She received her BA in journalism from the University of Oklahoma and her MA in digital journalism and design from the University of South Florida. Whether Tammie's in the newsroom, anchoring in the field, covering a special report, or writing a weekly, Emmy-nominated, A+ teacher segment, there's going to be a theme here in her bio. She gives a voice to those you may not normally hear from. In March of 2023, Tammie was named by Onyx Magazine as a Woman on the Move honoree. And in 2020, she was named one of Orlando Magazine's Women of the Year. In 2021, News 13 was recognized for Tammie's Justice for All, Hate Groups on the Rise episode with the regional Edward R. Murrow Award and the Florida Association of Broadcast Journalists Award for cultural and historical feature reporting. The list of organizations that have recognized her work would probably take up the rest of this program. She is the president of the Central Florida Association of Black Journalists and a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. But it is her love of history that has shaped her career. Her words, not mine. She has interviewed white supremacists David Duke and John Paul Rogers, a Central Florida former Grand Dragon of the United Klans of America, who ran for mayor of Lake Wales, Florida, as well as the leader of the Proud Boys, Enrique Torrio. I met Tammie just over a year ago when she was the host of a program where I was invited to be the keynote speaker. It was in Brevard County, and it was titled CRT, What It Is, What It Isn't, and Why It Matters. Tammie facilitated the question and answer session so masterfully that we engaged in conversation about our mutual interests, which you can see reflected in her bio. She is from a family of teachers, and she actually emailed me about this program on vacation in Charleston, where her family toured a plantation. We're kindred spirits. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce Miss Tammie Fields.
Your check is in the mail. Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. He'll get mad if I say Dr. Butler. So, Michael, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Oh, I know y'all can do better than that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. We are really going to have a great conversation this evening. So I want you all fired up about it. I am going to ask some questions after I introduce our special guest, but this will be your opportunity tonight to ask the questions you want to ask. So this is not a conversation where it will be primarily me talking all night. No, 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 no. I like to talk, but I want to give you an opportunity to hear from someone that I know many of you would likely not meet or have an opportunity to hear from in this kind of a setting on a normal day. So let me tell you a little bit about who we're going to be having this conversation with tonight. And I have to preface this by saying these are not my words. There is an author, Eli Saslow. These are his words regarding the gentleman that's here with us tonight. His name is Derek Black. He grew up at the epicenter of white nationalism. His father founded Stormfront, the largest racist community on the internet. His godfather, David Duke, was a KKK Grand Wizard. By the time that Derek had turned 19 years old, he had become an elected politician with his own daily radio show, already regarded as the leading light of the burgeoning white nationalist movement. And I'm quoting here, "We can infiltrate," Derek once told a crowd of white nationalists. "We can take the country back." Then he went to college. Derek had been homeschooled by his parents, steeped in the culture of white supremacy, and he had rarely encountered diverse perspectives or direct outrage against his beliefs. At New College of Florida, he continued to broadcast his radio show in secret each morning, living a double life until a classmate uncovered his identity and sent an email to the entire school. Quote, "Derek Black, white supremacist, radio host, New College student, question mark, question mark, question mark." Derek was confronted with the reality and also the consequences of that ideology at New College. He condemned it publicly. He lost connection with his family. He is here with us tonight to talk more about it. Derek, come on up to the stage. Give him a round of applause, please. I'm going to have a seat with Derek because we just want to have a conversation. Welcome. And thank you for agreeing to be here with us.
Thanks so much for being here.
So, thank you. Water. I want to just jump right in. And full disclosure, since Michael did, in fact, talk a little bit about my bio. I was a journalist at the University of Oklahoma, where I got my degree in journalism, minor in South African history. And when I went to Oklahoma City to Cocoa to work in 1995, something pretty bad happened. It was the Oklahoma City bombing. That was 1995, April 19th, 1995. And after that coverage, 180 hours of live coverage, and just seeing the devastation of domestic terrorism, I just decided that working behind the scenes was probably not suited for me, that I probably needed to be in front of the camera because there were stories I thought should have been told. Not saying they weren't being told, but I wanted to be a part of that. So I left Oklahoma City, went to a little town called Monroe, Louisiana, worked at KTBS. And one of the very first assignments that I was given was to go to a candidates forum. And I thought, oh, this is going to be easy, no big deal. But I was warned there might be somebody there that was not invited. And do you know who that was? It was your godfather, David Duke. This was a long time ago, too, 28 years ago. So I'm only 10 years old. Just kidding. Anyway, he was running for US Senate at the time. And I just remember being a young journalist just starting out. And I remember the ladies in the room, it's like someone sucked all the air out. And the ladies in the room who organized it, who I checked in with, hey, I'm with the media, I'm from KTBS. They ran over and apologized. And they said, we're so sorry. He's not supposed to be here. He wasn't invited. David Duke, I said, it's okay. It's no problem. And David Duke gave me an interview. Yeah. And so that was one of my very first interviews. And so I got a little bit of his history on camera. And we turned the story and we filed the story. So I thought I should give you that disclosure. So this is a full circle moment, meeting a family member, his godson. So Derek, again, thank you for being with us.
No, thank you so much for telling your own story as well.
Of course.
The connections are incredible.
Yeah. Small world. So tell me about white nationalism and how you were introduced to it at such an early age.
So David Duke was my mother's first husband, and they had met in college in the 1960s. And my dad was from Alabama and had met David on a road trip when they were both teenagers to a Nazi rally in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. It was the first white nationalist event they had ever gone to. It was in 1969. And they became very close friends, closest allies within this white power movement for the rest of their lives. And the three of them, David, my dad, and my mother, were central to a lot of changes that happened that really brought the movement together. And so by the time I was born, they had already been working to build this movement for over 30 years, like nearly 40 years at that point. And so by the time that I was born, it almost felt like I was, I don't know, their second child. It was like the thing that they had really worked on was this movement. And it was very clear to me that the way to be a part of their lives was to bring myself into it. I didn't think of it quite so explicitly, but it was definitely the reality of people coming over to the house to have strategy meetings about organizations. They hosted an annual Christmas party that brought white nationalists from all over the country when I was 2, 3, 4 years old. And then when I was older, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I started traveling with my dad to white nationalist conferences around the country, which are probably not what everybody thinks. They're usually hosted in hotel conference centers, and people wear suits and ties, and they have a banquet dinner, and they have a lot of academics. They'll have tenured faculty who have waited until some point in their career to start espousing white supremacy and try to give it this sort of like pseudoscientific legitimacy. And it's this culture that is working very hard to try to present itself as respectable, try to present itself as something that's politically acceptable, that should be granted more mainstream success. And I grew up right in the midst of it, and I met all of these leaders, and I really felt like I was seeing something that had been building for so long and was very tight knit, because it's a social movement that is, the main way you can define it is people's own self-identification. It's not something with members. It's not something with one organization. Many organizations pop up and go away. There's no dues. The thing that ties people together into this necessarily very tight-knit movement is the belief that they're a part of it, the symbols, the images, the martyrs, the stories. And that is something that goes many, many decades. And so once I was born into this and being raised right in the center of it, I fully embraced it, thought it was rational, and believed all the arguments. Ran for office. I ran an internet radio program on my dad's website when I was 16, 17, 18 years old. And that was the context that I ended up at college.
And you didn't just run for office. You got 60% of the vote, right? You won.
Yeah, it was a small local office, but it was, I registered to vote and registered to be on the ballot the same day. So, I could go in campaign, and I did it because I was trying to model what David had done. Because he only won one of those elections. Like, he won the state representative race in 1989, and then he ran for governor and he ran for senator, and he lost them, but he did get a majority of the white vote in Louisiana each time. And so that taught this movement, which has always been a marginal movement that saw opportunities to break through, the belief that they could persuade lots of people to come on board with their beliefs if they packaged it right. And when I was running for office when I was 19, I was doing that legacy. I was trying to model myself on the way that he did interviews, the way that my dad did interviews. And I did, in fact, it was a small office. So but it was sort of a case study. And it was in 2008. It was the same fall that Barack Obama was running for office in the first year, the first term. And the people who were voting for me were reacting to that. It was a Republican election in Palm Beach County.
We do know that after the election of President Barack Obama, the number and incidents of hate crimes went up, like skyrocketed. There's documentation for that. And so we know that that was almost like a calling card for people who were already either thinking about it or interested in being involved in hate groups, extremist groups. Those numbers did go up. So you're talking about your dad, David Duke, the people that were around you when you were growing up. What was your experience in school? Because we think of a public school education, in many cases, a private school education, with there being a great diversity of different people from different backgrounds. What was your experience?
Yeah, for the time that I was still allowed to be in it, that was my experience. It was a racially diverse public school. We had one of the largest per capita Jewish populations in the entire country. We got off for Yom Kippur each year, and we learned about it from fellow students. And that's a big reason why I was only in school until third grade. And at the end of third grade, my parents pulled me out and homeschooled me for the rest of that time. And so even then, it was impossible to experience other people, experience other cultures and religions, but it was no longer as interpersonal. It was no longer about close relationships. It was about going places, interacting, because extracurricular things and sports and volunteering, I would always interact with people, but it was always something that I kept an arm's length. I had to keep myself just outside of fully being a part of the communities that I was in, and trying to maintain this sort of internal bubble, which is why college kind of took me by surprise, that I thought I had experience interacting and moving through the world and still maintaining that this ideology, it doesn't harm people, it's rational, it's logical, all this like stuff I would say when I was a teenager and then my family said, and I thought I had been tested, right? And I didn't even necessarily see the difference between just interacting with someone and knowing them.
Let's talk about New College.
Sure.
Your dad was warned, right? Are you really going to let your son go to this school? But your parents were okay with you going.
They didn't stop me. They thought it was a surprising choice because New College was the honors college of the state university system, and it had 800 students at the time. It was in Sarasota, and it was notoriously politically liberal. Like it was on all these rankings for the top 10 most gay friendly and most pot friendly, and I don't know. It was like most hippie, like all these things that they thought were just questionable, but they weren't going to stop me from going where I wanted to go. And I also didn't see myself as looking to have my mind changed. I thought that I had been among the most rigorous arguments and that we were the people who knew what was accurate and correct. And so I was very open to people arguing with me because I thought I would learn better ways to, debate it at best. And I did not introduce myself as like, I am this white nationalist. And I also, it wasn't for the first time. I had spent most of my life trying to think I could lead these two lives where I could do interviews, be in national documentaries, run a children's site, run the radio, run for office even, and also just have these spheres where I could relate to people and talk to people and get to know them and just be on those terms. And most of the time that had always been the case. People would see me on TV, maybe try to bring it up, and I would do this pretty stonewalling body language that I just really don't want to talk about it. And they would accept that. They would say, I don't like that maybe. Some people distance themselves, but a lot of people just said, we'll find something we have in common and we'll just move on. And that didn't confront me. It was very clear at New College, though, that I spent this first semester there not telling anybody and nobody realizing, nobody Googling it, nobody outing me, nobody like recognizing my background. And I was deepening these relationships and also at the same time realizing New College was not going to be a place where that kind of passive acceptance was going to happen, and realizing that all these relationships I was building were going to hit a wall the moment they realized the depth of what I was not telling them. It just built up this huge amount of anxiety. Like I knew this was going to happen. I knew I had all these close relationships of people I really cared about. It was a community of people that I had come to care about, and I was just waiting for this shoe to drop. I did some things like freaking out and putting a magazine with an article about me, in the gym. I have no idea whether that's the thing, but I just could not handle it. And I was studying abroad the second semester when that finally happened, when somebody, an upper year, recognized who I was doing a thesis on the hate movement, and just sort of encountered me. And this enormous thread discussing me and sort of picking apart my life, now not by anonymous people, but by a community of people who I had gotten to know, were now calling me, an idiot, a racist, a hater. And they were specifically saying in front of the entire community about the ways that I was directly hurting them. And I was very defensive about it, like, oh, they don't understand, they don't get it, they don't quite get it. But it was the first moment in my life where it was not anonymous people on the internet. It wasn't the first time people had said racism is bad in a deluge of emails to me, but it was the first time that it was a community of people who I cared about and were saying that this is hurting me. And that was the context that I was coming back to campus in.
Let's talk about your friends, because you barely made it to the campus for orientation before you started being introduced to some diversity right off the bat. You met a Hispanic student, Juan. You met a Jewish student that you hung out with. When we talk about diversity, like right off the bat, you were starting to make friends and meet people. I get that inner struggle that you were having. You were sneaking away because you continued to do that, the show, this hate spewed show that your father started. Apparently the numbers for people who were listening shot up when you became a part of it. Mm-hmm. So when you were at college, you would go down on the yard and take the call into the show to be a part of the show?
Yeah, I would tell everybody that I was, calling this daily phone call to home. I was just, new college students had all sorts of weird quirks. People were very open to strange quirks, and calling your family every day at 9 a.m. was not the weirdest thing that anybody did. So people were, okay. And I would just
It is kind of weird though.
It was very strange. I thought I could maintain it. And it became this direct, I couldn't even turn my back on it. And I've gone back to the archives, all these years later, and I like pulling back, like feeling like not reacting, not responding. Eventually over what time goes on, like this full length of the story is just like not calling in, getting more and more harassed, but it stands in as like this line where I can see the connection to the world that I grew up in and the connection to the community that I was living in. And they were constantly pulling at each other. And it was this direct choice between I recognized relatively early between losing the entire community that I had ever grown up with, like the care of not only of my family, but everyone who had ever babysat me, everyone who I had met for the first 21 years of my life, and who were all of my personal, like extended family relations. We're at risk. It was it was going to be a choice of losing them, or if I was going to accept new values, I was going to accept that my current values were not aligned with what I was doing. There was just no way to have both of those things. And I think a lot of that story, when I look back on it, is that tension of recognizing increasingly and clearly and loudly what is the right choice, and simultaneously recognizing how deep and powerful and terrifying it feels to make the choice to sever. And as long as I could think, oh, I'm doing the thing that's correct, it's factual, it's moral. But once all these pieces get taken away, which is what happened when I came back, people started engaging with me. I attended a Shabbat dinner that I had gotten to know one of the people before I was outed, who just wanted to give me a space on campus where I wouldn't feel exactly comfortable, but where I could at least engage. And people I met there, one of them is now my wife, but like that's a longer story, and really engaged with me and gave me the sort of tools to pick apart all the things and get to a point where it's not factual, it's not moral, there's no misconceptions, there's no misunderstandings. It's just a question of either being consistent if I say that I care about people and making that choice to lose this connection to my family. And it felt like a gut-wrenching decision, but it also felt like weirdly shallow. It was like, am I going to be the person I say I am, or am I not?
When we talk about your family, this book, and I probably should have brought it up earlier. Sorry, guys. Last week is here. Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. In this book, there really is a clear picture of this struggle between you and your parents. There is a lot in here about your parents and their love for you, which I was telling you this earlier, is very clear. You're the only child, right? Your parents supported you in every single endeavor you ever tried and that you ever did. This thing, though, white nationalism, that's been like a breaking point in your relationship with your parents. Tell us about that.
So after I was back for several years, and it was really a slow process. It wasn't one where I came back and saw a community that was so hurt and said, oh, well, okay, I'm just going to, because I thought it was not only, I mean, look back on it, I see it as, it's an identity, but I saw it then as a whole worldview and a bunch of facts and knowledge. And I had to go through that process of losing the facts, disregarding the arguments, seeing how they're abusing statistics and how things are illogical and all. But that took time, and it took argument, and it took intervention by other people. But once I had done all that, it was really just a choice of what to do about it. And I was deeply tempted, and I really wanted, I argued that couldn't I just be silent now? Like, wouldn't that be the moral choice even? If I had spoken out, I'd run a website, I hadn't just believed the things my family said, I had argued them myself, I had created better ways to market them, I had figured out ways to sort of try to expand the movement. Didn't that mean that I had no right to keep speaking? And it was like a further argument that the only way you counter anything is by speaking. And it was getting to that point where it meant that the reason I'm avoiding this, like, that's clear. The reason I'm avoiding this is that breaking point. And so that summer I wrote a public letter, thought it all through, put the arguments against white nationalism, put sort of a vague outline of what had been happening in my personal life those last few years, and then published it on an anti-racist website, which was Southern Poverty Law Center, that had a blog that both everyone in the white nationalist movement read every day and people all over the anti-racist movement would read. I knew it would be this sort of common point. And I did not tell my family at all that I was going to do it. They knew that I had been withdrawing. They knew that I was no longer doing the radio show. They knew that I no longer posted. They knew that I didn't come home very much, but they didn't realize at all the extent of my conviction. And so their initial thought was that I'd been hacked, or like it was fake or something. And when I confirmed it, it felt, and my dad explicitly told me at one point in these days of conversation that it felt like not that I had died, but that he just wished I had never existed. It was just this sort of darkness of a question, of more than a question of whether we could ever communicate in any way again. And it was about a week of that. And these sort of off and on conversations while I was still staying in Sarasota, house sitting for some professors who were traveling over the summer. And I was about to leave Florida. I was going to go to grad school, go start a medieval history grad program. And I drove home. My dad convinced me to come see him one more time, and it was his birthday. and the rest of the family would not let me in. People came out and said like, I couldn't come to the front door. And so he ended up leaving this party, and he and I went somewhere and we talked, and I gave him all of my arguments. He thought he sort of dismissed them. So like, oh, I've heard all the arguments against racism before, just not from you. And was shocked to just feel like we were still the same people. And since then, it's been 10 years now since that summer. So exactly a decade now. We've never been able to be close. We talk on holidays. We talk on birthdays on the phone when major family things happen. I've been back a handful of times over that decade. But the relationship I don't think I've ever spoken to either of my parents since that day where they have not brought it up, where they have not brought up the feeling of betrayal and the feeling of loss that they had that day. And it's always, as far as I can tell, always going to be central. And I think it does speak to a lot of their commitment that they decided they were going to keep communicating. Like other family members who I've not spoken to in 10 years, most of them. But my parents communicate, and I know it's incredibly hard for them. And I don't know, there's some lesson. I don't know. I still don't know exactly what that lesson is, but the connection that I was trying to argue even that week was bigger than ideology. And I think that they don't know how to say that, but they believe it in some way by the way they act.
Was your dad and your mom at your wedding?
Well, we were able to sidestep this by getting married in April of 2020. So nobody was at the wedding, and I was
Smarty.
Yes, it was intentional.
I don't want to take too much time because I want to make sure the audience has an opportunity to ask you some questions, but I've said the name of the website enough, so I'm not going to say it again, but I do want to say that Southern Poverty Law Center published a report connecting that website to more than 100 murders. Yeah. And I do just want to mention that we have seen an uptick in attacks like Mother Emanuel in Charleston, where churchgoers were shot and killed, at a Bible study, and at a Walmart in Texas where Hispanics were targeted. You and your father with your show, and I know you even created a show for children. I just wonder, in 2023, do you wonder if all of those seeds that were planted in the talk, in the speech, do you ever feel responsible?
Yes, actually, and it's intangible. It's not. It's sort of, but that sometimes makes it feel sort of infinite. That it's not something that I can ever quite balance out. And I only really. It's something that I was much more fraught about in the initial years, because I have started to feel more at peace with the fact that I can only speak forward. I can only act and I can only test my own values now and go with what I've learned. But everyone I know, everyone I knew growing up still believes it, still puts out messages, still spreads propaganda. And some of these messages are things that I helped popularize, that I taught them to popularize. And the fact that I can never take anything back, I can never stop or control anything that I created. At one point, I founded a seminar to teach people how to better message white nationalism in a way that they could get it into the media, that they could run political campaigns, that they could run their own radio shows. And that messaging just, the conference continues. They still hold the conference because that I started with the same title and the same structure. and this lesson of the ripples and the responsibility of anything that I think anyone creates is this sort of weight that I don't it's hard to even exactly live with. I think I do take a lot more peace than I did in the beginning, though, that can create more, can always try to do something better the next day. And I don't know, it's not always completely satisfying.
Thank you for your honesty, Derek. This is a heck of a conversation, isn't it? The children's version of the website that we were just talking about, there were comments disparaging Dr. Martin Luther King. There were white pride songs on there too, and this is for children to learn. And I know we were just talking about the history, just, is it like a block over where Lincolnville is where Dr. King slept? What goes through your mind, just that reality?
And I'm staying in Lincolnville, and I walked past the house that King slept in '64. I've been thinking about specifically St. Augustine, in the weeks and months leading up to this. Just, I grew up in Florida. My family has lived in Florida a really long time. They came in 1914. My great-great-grandparents moved to South Florida. They've been present and involved over the generations in these epics of a state that I have only really over the last few years come to recognize just how much it shaped me and my family. It's not just an American story, the particular version of people that my family are is really a uniquely Florida story. Like my mother talked about some incredibly brutal forms of segregation in West Palm Beach, in the city that, prides itself on being very democratic and voting liberal, and yet is incredibly segregated today, is incredibly split on wealth, where schools are completely divided by not just race, but all the wealth that seems to accumulate in it. And it is all this record of the same state and the same colonial situation. And all the people in my family are almost like a microcosm of it. I grew up in it, and I cannot possibly believe that I would be the same person had I not grown up in a society where I looked around and saw that. Like, the scars of it were in my own neighborhood. And there's something I think I say when people ask me about why people find white nationalism persuasive. And a lot more people, I can say this as somebody who pitched it, won elections on it, a lot more people find the arguments of white nationalism persuasive than people who become white nationalists. That's a small number, tens of thousands of people who become members of this movement, and this movement that produces so much violence, this movement that runs candidates for office and all the things it does. It's small. It's genuinely not, you're talking about tens of thousands of people, but the number of people that they reach, and people ask, well, why is it persuasive? And it is because people look around at a society where there is such very clear injustice, where there is such inequality, where we're talking about white people this is appealing to them, recognize the injustice of how exactly their own neighborhood is structured, and know that there is a choice between feeling like they have to dramatically change something tomorrow about the way the world is, or they have to accept that things are the way they are for good reason. And white nationalism tells them that nothing needs to change and that they don't need to worry about anything. And I think that oversimplifies it, but I think in other ways it doesn't. I ran seminars on this message, didn't quite understand it in the same way that I do now, but it was the fact that white nationalism tells people that they don't have to do anything. It doesn't tell them they have to go out and be martyrs. It doesn't tell them they have to go run for office. It tells them they don't need to do anything, and they need to accept exactly as things are is the moral, right, good way for them to be. And so to answer the question about walking around, I mean, I study history. I find studying history compelling and a great way to, spend my time. But the reason that I got there is because I grew up in this family that was being so influenced and affected by the scars on the land around them. And they chose not just to do nothing, but to so strongly reify that they couldn't accept it was a crime. They had to create an entire worldview that justified everything around them and said that they didn't have to do anything, and they spent their entire lives trying to work on it. And they never they were responding to the same choice we all have, and it's just the environment, it's the life, it's built around us. And I don't think anybody doesn't see it. I think everybody just makes a decision, and what that decision looks like is different depending on the person.
I remember the documentaries, Derek, where we learned about Dr. King in his last days. He knew that his death was imminent and that he was going to lose his life in the civil rights movement. And then in reading this book, there is a portion of the book where your dad is worried about you because as a white nationalist, this show is picking up, you're getting all these hits and all this interest, and the amount of people that are listening continues to grow and grow and grow. And there's a part in here when you are elected where your dad's getting these, middle of the night calls, these really scary calls. And I just remember when I was reading that passage, I was thinking of the love your dad had for you. You were just 19, I think, right? You're a kid, basically. The love your dad had for you, and that he cut on the cameras for the home security. He took these calls. He was kind of pacing the floor because he was so worried about your safety. And these calls were just basically some really bad calls, threatening your life. And then I thought about what it must have been like for Coretta Scott King and for Dr. King and just those threats, and what life must be like to live thinking at any given moment what you care about the most could be gone in an instant, that you could lose your life, basically. But your dad got a taste of that with those calls, and I would have thought he would have been terrified about that. Did he ever talk to you about that?
Yeah, he was genuinely afraid a lot of the time. And it wasn't just then. I had grown up when I was very young, a mail bomber who did kill several people. The FBI caught him, and our address was on the list. And so there were months after that period where the FBI caught all of our packages and scanned them before they brought them to us, just in case anything had already gotten out before they got him. We had people who did come to the house and break in and sort of come and intimidate. It was this sort of direct visceral fear that I think he definitely was open about. He talked about. We were very aware of it. And I think I almost look back on it as I feel like it stands in for some of the bigger fear. I hope I'm not getting too conceptual about this, but I do try to think about my family and just what drove them. And it's, hate is not an inaccurate word. Like hate, when we talk about hate movements and just contempt and despising people, like this sort of just disgust a lot of the time that just fills white racists in the way they view other people. But the most driving action, the thing that made them feel justified, the thing that made them justify anything was fear. It was that no matter what, they could say that they were the ones with their backs against the wall. They were the ones who felt in danger. They were the ones who felt this fear. And the fact that they felt that fear, they needed to rationalize it. They needed a good argument. They needed a community to support them. And it was the fear that made everything possible, that made anything possible.
So I want to open the conversation up now for anyone. Have we talked a lot? Because I have a whole lot more questions. I get 10 more minutes. Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, we talked about that. Tell me a little bit about what your life is like now.
So for several years after I condemned my family and condemned the movement, I did think I could be silent. I tried really hard. I mean, I went to elaborate lengths and I felt like I was living in hiding for years, for 3 years. I legally swapped my middle and first name. I was teaching and doing graduate school and just trying to sort of act as if I could move on. I lived in fear of people Googling me again, of the same feeling of what had happened at New College, but I sort of reenacted it, the kind of like, I'm gonna just never tell anybody about this. And it was a few years of realizing that writing the letter had been right, condemning had been right, engaging in that way at New College had been right. And it was not only the right thing to speak, especially as the decade wore on and and the white nationalist movement was becoming more prominent. Seeing this is before the Charlottesville marches, before the election of Trump brought so many people out into public. But in that year or so, it was really becoming so clear that it was incredibly naive to believe, and it was something I just kind of wanted to be true, that this was a movement that was just going away. It was maybe people were right that having Barack Obama be president meant the white nationalist movement would die, and I knew that was never true. I had known that it was that election and re-election had been the high points of membership. I had known that people throughout the country subscribe to this movement and believe it, and there's no way to tell them apart. It's not, people do not walk around and have, shaved heads and swastikas on their foreheads. They come from every economic background. They are small business people. They are people in white collar work and lawyers and doctors. And I knew them. I saw them growing up. They live every suburb and city in America. They don't look like anything, and they just don't talk about it. And that is the reality of what this movement is. And I still just wanted to not hold responsibility for it. And speaking out was a really difficult choice. Like, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to feel the guilt and shame about it. I didn't want to be confronted by it. I didn't want to talk about it. And those things haven't changed, but I've just gotten better at getting over them. And so speaking out did make things easier, though, because it made me realize that I could live both parts of my life at the same time. Since then, I get to work with great social justice organizations. I work a lot with Facing History and Ourselves. I've done a lot of work talking about German memorialization and these sort of projects and bringing them to the United States. It's this sort of engagement on curricula. I've worked with people on immigration, talking on speaking out about how to talk about immigration in America. It's really been something where I felt like I could finally be a person and try to actually not just condemn my family, but actually be a person that I want to be. And it really took being open enough to be willing to meet the people who I could work with to do that. And I think I've never gotten to any points, never been at a point in my life where I felt more holistic, more like there weren't multiple threads. It was one person living my life, engaging in the ways that I wanted to engage in the world. And I don't think that ever would have been possible had I just kept in that place where just, please don't ever ask me about this again. And it was very painful to do it. And I guess I don't want to say that in a way that tries to elicit a huge amount of sympathy, but it's like a personal experience of it is just taking that kind of responsibility for not personal action for sure, but also just the broader community that I don't associate with, I don't talk to, I haven't talked to most anyone in my family in 10 years. And yet I still feel a connection to them. And I still feel some ways responsible for them and the ways that they speak, not in a direct way. I don't feel everything they say, that's what they've said, but in the way that I feel responsible for a lot of things that happen around me and people I engage with and the world I live in. And not running away from that was difficult and also incredibly rewarding.
I should say too, you were expected to be the heir to David Duke. This is the promise that your father saw in you when you were young. We are in the state where people take their kids to Disney. Your parents, or was it your father and David Duke that took you to a Klan rally in Arkansas?
No, yeah, that's true. It was my dad. It was actually, he had quit the Klan, like left leadership of the Klan about 4 years before I was born. And so I grew up with this vision of like, oh, we don't use that imagery. We don't support that. Not that he thought it was wrong, but that he thought it was bad imagery. He thought you could never be a responsible political organization because people would always just associate the Klan with violence. And he wanted to try to get away from this image of violence. And yet he was always drawn to it. And so that Klan rally was a couple of years before I went to New College. It was the organization that he had left. It was the people who had taken it over, and they hadn't been in touch. They hadn't communicated. They got back in touch with him, and he brought me there. And it was the first time I couldn't even believe it, because he'd spent his whole life talking about how separate he was, how his white nationalist community online was a new thing, that it was a new umbrella. And at that point, he felt like he no longer had anything to prove to anyone. He felt like he no longer needed the press to get more attention because his website was self-sustaining. It had hundreds of thousands of people coming to it. He no longer felt like he needed to prove anything to anyone. And the way that I think he expressed that was by going back to the imagery, to the world, to the culture that had inspired him when he was a teenager, that he had been drawn to and then repulsed by, and then brought back to, for all the same reasons that I think some of us, like everybody is. You like look at this like history of the Klan and how deeply embedded it is in America. And once he thought that his movement could ride on its own, no longer needed a spokesman, no longer needed to market itself appropriately, he went there. It was the only cross burning I've ever seen in my entire life. And it was like him exhaling. It was like him thinking that he had gotten to a point, and the country had gotten to a point where he no longer needed to pretend anything. And then that was about 18 months before I went to New College for the first time. And one of the first conversations I had with one of the people there was somebody who had grown up near where that Klan organization was, and didn't know that I knew these people, didn't know that I had any connection, didn't know there was any reason I'd have any connection. I was a personally kind person, I was very open to their life and experience. And I remember sitting there in the dorm one night, where all just being college students, and they were saying one of the upsetting things was this Klan group that was just outside of town that just made it kind of terrifying to grow up being realizing these people hated them. And realizing just it wasn't very long before I had been at their dinner table, and those people would have not even cared at all. And I knew I couldn't convince them to care. And I knew that I cared about this person. And it was just this, like, I don't know, it was this moment of realizing that if I can recognize the actual terror of a person, and I know that I could never bring it back to my community and make them change in any way, I wasn't ready to condemn them at that point. I hadn't even been outed yet, but it was a feeling that I think stood in for everything that happened afterwards. It's this tension of like, could I have both? Could I have both spaces? And you can't. You have to decide if you're going to stand up for people or not.
It is so remarkable to me that you come from this family, white nationalism, just embedded in their belief system. And then you go to a Klan rally, and this is a tiny town in Arkansas, way up north in Arkansas. It's a town I had never even heard of. And then when you go to school in Sarasota, you literally are meeting someone and talking to someone from close to that area. It's just really remarkable. It really is.
I could not believe it.
Yeah.
I could not believe what they were telling me.
And they're sharing with you that knowledge of what happened in that town and how terrifying it was. It's remarkable. All right. So just by show of hands, how many of you all have questions of Derek and that you'd like to ask him? Woohoo! We love questions. Do we?
Yeah, I think the way that we're going to handle this is that our honors students have index cards. If you have a question, please raise your hand. They will pass out the card. You can write the card on the card. If your question is so long that you have to flip it, you might need to rephrase the question. So if you can please raise your hands, our students will pass out the cards and I'll collect them, curate them, and they'll go to Tammy and to Derek. I have a quick question, maybe to open it up as we wait on the cards to be distributed. Derek, can you tell me a little about a word that you used, and that's atonement? You said that one of the processes in coming to grips with this was realizing the impact of the hurt you had caused. What is the process of atonement, making right the things that you believed hurt people? And is continuing to speak on platforms like this a part of that atonement process in your mind?
The last part, yes. I think I tend to give the common advice. I like when people sometimes reach out for like, what is the way you fix the world? I tell them there's no answer to that, but that my experience is that everybody has a different way of interacting at different contact points, and that my experience told me that the only way things change is by other people talking to each other. And so the mass changes in the world are all individual people talking to each other. It's never bigger than that. And so there's nothing more powerful than speaking one-on-one. And we're here at a venue, but this is a relatively small event. We'll be talking to each other. And I think like that's always something to really remember. It's the one-on-one conversations that never seem quite so important at the time that are the most important thing that ever happens in the world. In the process of atonement, I think is a big answer, and I do not feel like I can answer the process of atonement as an answer, but I can give like personally, I always had a lot of trouble individually apologizing to people. Like that was a just even beginning with going up to people who I had just deceived and just in a very human interpersonal way saying, I recognize how much that hurt you and I am very sorry and I'm so sorry for this. It took me a long time. It took me all the time I was at college to get to a point. I knew how to publicly condemn it more easily than I knew how to walk up to individual people and say I was sorry. And I thought that was a lesson, and it's not atonement, and it is trying to live aligned with what my values are. And I was talking before we came in here about the one thing that I feel like I've learned came from that period where I was quiet, silent, not engaging, and thinking I could somehow, I would never be able to leave it behind, but I could just try to live in exile, I guess. And I didn't know how to answer what was the right thing. And I came up with the only answer I've really come up with was asking whether what I am doing or what I am thinking is always trying to find ways that I am connected to more and more people. Why there are people who I think are so distant from me, and what I'm doing is trying to find a way to feel connected or responsible or just caring about other people who I never thought about how I was connected to them. And that takes an infinite number of forms in your life, in your job, your career, your romantic relationships, your friendships, all these things. And it's a actual test that you can apply the things you're doing, and you can do the reverse and say, is what I'm doing trying to find ways that I can divide myself from other people? And if you're doing that, in whatever way, big or small, it shouldn't be aligning with your values. And that's the only way that I've actually felt to be consistent in my process of living a life where I'm not going to be filled with so much regret as I was the first time. That's how I try to lead it.
Thank you. If you have your card, your question written, could you please, and I'll pick up some and the students will pick them up.
Thank you. Question number 1, Derek, what made you choose New College?
It was really the same reason that most Florida students, I think, who end up there choose it. And it is the honors college, which in practice meant that it was this tiny little liberal arts college that had remarkably cheap tuition and was in my backyard. I didn't know about it until I learned about it on NPR one day. Most people in Sarasota seem like they've never heard of New College. It's, it's so small that you drive past it and it takes 30 seconds on TAMMIE. And it was life-changing, but it was because of the structure of the whole state university system that made it possible. My family, they didn't have it. They had enough money, they're middle class, but they didn't have a huge amount of money. I didn't have a huge amount of money, and like tuition was a real thing, and availability, and my dreams were pretty big for growing up in this movement and thinking we could change the world, but I couldn't always imagine exactly what my personal life should look like. And New College was something that I could wrap my mind around. And it was bigger than I realized, but it seemed like something that I could get involved with. And it comes down to just that. It was the academic rigor, the structure, the promise, and the fact that it was there and available. And I understood how to get there, which is the story of a lot of people who end up there. Actually, there's a lot of self-selection that goes on in people going there. And it's a place where it wasn't, oh, you're going to go there, you're going to go to some like private liberal arts college in the Northeast or something. Like, that's not the decision. The decision is like maybe University of Florida, I guess, or this insane hippie liberal arts college that's going to try to challenge everything you've ever thought about the world. Like those are the things.
Was there something specific that you wanted to study when you went there?
I already wanted to study medieval history. And they had the best medieval history program, not just in Florida, but in like one in the country. It was great.
Wow. This question, Derek, I know you are writing your own book and that it is almost done. What did you want to share in the first person that wasn't in the book about you? And there's a 2-part to this. And then what can you share with us about what led you to want to dig deeper and say more?
Could you say the first part of the question? The first question?
So what did you want to share in the first person that wasn't in this book?
Oh, I talked in my own book a lot about what my experiences of my of like being a loyal person and trying to live up to the expectations of my family and my community. And that's something that is a bit intangible. You can list the things I did, but the feeling of it was this never attainable, but I could always try my best to be the person that everybody needed and to try to live up to, even help identify what their dreams were and try to make them exist in the world. And I think that feeling is something that I don't know how relatable anything about my story is, but it feels like the most intangible human part of my life. And I was always trying to put that in there as like what it felt like along the way, as opposed to an outside journalist who could look at it and say the actions and sort of make the definition between what did you do, what did you not do, as opposed to I do talk about a lot of the same things. It's my experience of it and who was there and how it felt.
And then the second part, what can you share with us about what led you to want to dig deeper and say more? You may have answered that, but that was the second part.
It that I think I've always wanted, even when this book was written, I wanted to write something, and it was not become more narrative memoir than I expected, but it's still at its core, the feeling that I always am worried about and always sort of consumed by, which is what is the right thing to do? And that's something I've always worried about. I think it's because I grew up in, this family that's an activist movement family, but they had one lesson that has just never gone away, which is that if there is something that is wrong and you have identified it and you feel strongly about it, you have this moral imperative to do something. But what you do is everything changes based on what you do. And I think I've spent most all of my life asking that question. And I always wanted, or at least the last handful of years, wanted to write something that was about that, about how do I decide? How does anyone decide? How do you look around at the world and see how everybody decides? If I'm going to do something, what is that going to be and why, and how do I value it? And that's what I've really been centering in the way I've written.
What would you say is at the root of the fear that white nationalists have? What fuels it?
I think, I feel like this is going to sound a little bit psychoanalytical, but I really genuinely believe there are people who study the white power movement. I know a lot of them, I meet them, and it's always this sort of strange thing because they've learned it from the archives and I've learned it from meeting that guy once. And you can do sociological studies, you can do historical studies on this movement, and that is all very legitimate, and I wouldn't dismiss it at all. But having lived through it and knowing all these people, they're deeply afraid, that's for sure. And I don't think that it is underselling it to say it is the fact that they look around at a world that is so deeply unfair, so deeply unjust, so deeply divided, and benefits them. They recognize that it benefits them, and they have to come up with an answer. They have to say, am I just fine being immoral? Am I fine living in a world that's a crime? Or am I not? So all these people could have gone down roads of being pretty convicted anti-racist. Like there is a deep sense of moral action. And I don't want to get too much into that because I don't think it's exactly the same thing, but a deep sense of like, if they believe something, they have to do something about it. The sort of like conviction. But the conclusion they came to was the world as it was had to be justified. And I think the reaction to that was fear, like the reaction to realizing that the world was deeply unjust. They had to justify it. The only way they could exist in it was to justify it. Does not leave anyone who comes to that conclusion with a sense of contentment and peace.
In this book, it says in some occasions that at least from your father and some of the things that were on the website, it talked about change and how the country was changing quickly and how communities of color seem to be increasing. What kind of those kinds of things? I mean, I think there's even a line in this book that I was struck by. It was take our country back. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you heard that as a part of this fear?
Yeah, that is the way they express it is deeply apocalyptic. Like the white nationalist ideology is one that it believes race is biological. It believes that race is the main distinguishing factor in humanity, and that it predicts all these things and intelligence and criminality and all this stuff that they like look at the world and they just like try to rationalize it and deeply build their whole worldview on it. But the way they actually live their life is thinking that they know the future, and they know that the future is destruction. They see the entire civilization of the world as like a fragile house that is collapsing. They see armies, they see people dying, they see unending war. Like their future that they are absolutely convinced is coming is one that is just like nuclear war and destruction. And some of them think they're accelerating that, and they're like gonna come through it better because they're prepared, and that's like a kind of person that exists. And then a lot of them just live feeling that way in terror of this inevitable future that they think they can't do anything about. And some of them, like the ones who I feel like are the most easy to love, and I say that with like real caution, like there's a lot of these people who I know them, I love my family, and I would describe them as living in absolute terror about the inevitable violence that they think is going to happen in the world. And the fact that they think they can't do anything about it is just every single day is one step closer to horror. And it's just it's an awful way to live.
And it's not based on anything that has happened
No,
to them.
it's not something necessarily they haven't had. Most of them have not had some bad experience with anyone. I think I kind of hear that misconception. People think like, oh, you're like got attacked at school or mugged or something. And it's like the number of stories of people who have any kind of reason like that. I mean, I feel like it's almost like a myth. People who come to the white nationalist movement, and need to pull in some data and stats and pull it up on the screen, but I don't have that prepared. I am willing to assert, though, that the average person who comes and becomes a major part of the white nationalist movement is on average more income or more wealth than the average per capita white person, and lives in a slightly, not necessarily less diverse, but higher income neighborhood where the fear of loss is what they're talking about, not the experience of it.
Did you read all these questions?
There were a lot of them, and yes, I did.
Okay. Are you okay with the one regarding Flagler College?
Oh,
I better hold off on this one.
maybe that was my question. Maybe no, maybe we'll skip that one.
Okay. I'm a high school. Oh, this is great. I'm a high school U.S. history teacher in Fort Myers, Florida, and we have been encouraged to protect the feelings of our white students. And to be clear, I was saying this great that this is a teacher that's sending this to me. We're told not to teach about racism because it could make our white students feel guilty. Do you think guilt and shame are inevitable when deconstructing a racist worldview? If so, how do we guide folks through those feelings?
Right. I mean, I can say with just absolute certainty that they're not inevitable because I've worked with a lot of German teachers who deal with the weight and guilt and responsibility of the Holocaust in elementary school. They teach it much younger than even some of the school districts in America that are more comfortable talking about the difficult history in America. And I have sat with families, I've sat with kids, I've sat with teachers in group settings where we like discussed, you know, what's the takeaway? What you're feeling here? And it is empowerment. And I'm talking about anecdotal. I'm talking about, you know, dozens of people, hundreds of people, but I can at least 100% guarantee it's not inevitable because all of them knew that there were dark things in the world. There were horrible things that people had done. They didn't want to feel responsible for all the horrible things. They wanted to feel responsible for making sure it never happened again. They wanted to feel responsible for changing the face of their neighborhood and putting up memorials or statues, making people remember so that they could feel like they weren't hiding from something. I mean, that's the feedback I got. And I think if we ponder it and think it through, it makes a lot of sense that the feeling of empowerment and care and responsibility is what is going to come from learning about history. And it feels like counterintuitive to me and disingenuous to say that honestly looking at the past is going to make somebody feel just so horrible because they were the thing that they can be responsible for is what they do now. And why should they feel bad about what they're doing now? Like, why do they need to feel bad about that?
Another question, how important is your formal education beyond homeschooling in the transformations, of your life, and why medieval history?
Right. My education at New College was like, the main thing that engaged with me was the community of students, and that's something I was foreground, but the education was very important as well, particularly because it required that I engage very rigorously and not just say, oh, this seems right. Like New College was the place where, particularly when I was doing medieval history, where something that was sort of like the vague past got grounded in, well, the reason we know this is because there are these 4 documents on pieces of calfskin, and here's what they say. And like, they're this battle that everybody talks about, there's 3 sentences about it. This is it. We're reading it right now. What do we know? And that kind of grounding in what do we know, not just like what's the past, but how do we know it? What do we know? What's here? What's the relics? And the relics are all around us. Like we have buildings, we have cities, we have pieces of objects, and we have books and we have records, but we don't have everything. And we have to understand it and filling in all those gaps. And professors were never talking about ideology, but they did talk about, here's kind of a wild misconception or a statement that people often think about the Middle Ages. Here's the sources they're basing it on. Do you read that in it? And so it was never a case of like confront me. Like professors never even acknowledged they knew anything about me. They would just do this like, oh, Derek, what do you think? They were just like very quiet about it. And so it wasn't even before I was known on campus, it wasn't something that was trying some kind of campaign for me. It was just what does a rigorous education do for a person? It has been very important for me. And what was the last question? Why medieval? Oh, actually, it actually just it's about as boring as why I went to New College. It was interested in learning languages, and I wanted to do something that most people thought was not relevant to the current situation. I was so exhausted from constantly being engaged and asked about the most horrendous and hot social topics of today that I thought, oh, if I do the Middle Ages, nobody will ever ask me about the present again. Turns out to not be true.
Next question. Can you talk about what it was like seeing the ideas you grew up with become mainstream at the same time that you were leaving them behind, specifically with the rise of youth white nationalist movements?
Sorry, could you repeat? I'm pondering the first part of that question, actually.
Can you talk about what it was like seeing the ideas that you grew up with become mainstream at the same time when you were trying to leave those behind in the dust, especially when you saw youth white nationalist movement?
It was the experience at first was, if you're familiar with what they call the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, where you know a lot about something and you start seeing it everywhere. And I thought I didn't really think this, but it was bizarre, especially in 2015 and 2016, when white nationalist movement was marching and there were explainers in the New York Times called with the title, "What is White Nationalism?" And before that, I thought no one in the world had heard that term. I remember at New College, one of the first reactions of the campus body was, "What is that?" As opposed to, yes, this is a present political concern. And it was a present political concern, but not in a way that they were as aware. I remember Hillary Clinton in 2016 giving a speech about explaining white nationalism to the people in her audience. And it just felt absolutely surreal. It felt like a world that I had been convinced was on the verge of coming into its own in the mainstream for so many years, had reckoned with the responsibility of my engagement, my actions, but had tried to convince myself that it was so small, because I got out into the world and most people just don't talk about, don't debate racism. Most people spend most of their days just ignoring it or not thinking about it or not looking around at the world. It's not just most people I encountered once I got out away from my family seemed like they didn't notice anything. And so I tried to convince myself that it was fading away. It was a small movement, and it was a small movement, but that it wouldn't have an outsized impact. And seeing it rise around me while I tried to ignore it is one of the most uncomfortable, surreal, dreamlike experiences that I ever had. I look back on it and I'm very proud and glad that I eventually engaged, but there were a couple of years where I felt like I was trying to hide my gaze from the fact that this thing that I had kind of outrun was surrounding me.
You mentioned your study of history a number of times. How has the study of history, and specifically medieval history, impacted your changing worldview. How have these issues affected your graduate study at an institution in Chicago, where historians of the Middle Ages have used that platform as a space to argue for racism?
Mm.
Yeah, we have faculty there who have done this, yes. And there are faculty and people have used the Middle Ages for decades, centuries actually, to argue about the supremacy of the Western culture and to try to understand like why is Europe so great. And there's a long lineage of using medieval studies as a field, as a vehicle for justifying white supremacy. You can go into even the American founding period and, look at Jefferson talking about the Anglo-Saxons and all these myths about culture. And the University of Virginia, where the Charlottesville March happened, was the first institution, I think it was the first public institution, maybe the first institution in the United States to teach Anglo-Saxon, to teach Old English as a language, because he was trying to connect medieval Europe to the sort of white supremacist world order they were creating in America. And picking that part is something that has only in the last decade really become a major facet of medieval studies. And so this field that I went into, thinking naively as a teenager that nobody would ever ask me about it, and white nationalists would be pleased because they could just assume I was studying Europe or something, and everybody else would have no idea what even the Middle Ages was, has really changed. It's now a field that reckons with its responsibility to counter white supremacy, to challenge all these myths about Europe as some sort of like I don't know, whatever it is, this sort of like crucible that creates all the things that pour out of the Pandora's box of white supremacy in a good way, is like how a lot of medievalists have tried to do it, and trying to confront that and at least make people uncomfortable to not engage in some way has become a major facet of the field. And I try to engage in that. I'm working in Augustinian ideas of slavery and justifications for slavery, opposition to slavery, and the way those things, I don't do the way those things get picked up, but they do get picked up in colonial eras, justifications for slavery and the creation of race. And I think the problem is maybe even like a subtler extension of my idea of trying to always be more and more connected to more people. Like you get issues when you try to silo off your field and say that it's not connected to everything else. And some of the best parts that have changed in medieval studies are trying to recognize that the firm boundaries of Europe are kind of fake. The firm boundaries of timelines are kind of fake. If you work together and try to understand the blurred pieces, you end up making something that's a lot more true.
As much as I have enjoyed this conversation, I think we could go for another hour easily. However, I do not want to exhaust our guests. There are plenty of questions in there that are just as thought-provoking and just as deliberate and reflective. However, the college has a special treat for all of the visitors in honor of our speakers tonight and in honor of the speakers who are participating in this forum. We have a wine and cheese reception in the lobby so that we can meet each other, we can talk to each other. We may be able to ask Tammy, we may be able to ask Derek the questions that we did not get to ask on the index cards. So we are going to do that. And in the meantime, please join me in thanking our guests tonight for a wonderful program. Thank you both so much, and we will have the reception in the lobby.